Lightning pierced the night sky as I stood at the towering gates of the grand estate. The wind whipped my hair against my face, and rain pelted my shoulders, soaking my coat until it felt like a heavy blanket. My heart pounded with dread. I knew I should leave, but something inside me said I had to find the courage to press the buzzer and go inside. A voice in my head whispered that my life was about to change, but I did not yet know if it was for better or worse. The gates creaked open, revealing a long, winding driveway lined with ancient oak trees. Their branches shook and seemed to warn me away, but I forced myself to take one unsteady step after another. As I neared the sprawling mansion, thunder boomed so loudly that my ears rang. The storms in Redwood Falls were harsh, but this was especially violent. Even as I trembled, I kept going, feeling as though an invisible hand was pushing me forward. At the front door, I saw the bright glow of a security light. My reflection stared back at me in the shimmering puddles on the ground. I looked frightened, but also determined. I swallowed hard and rang the bell. My teeth chattered from a cold, but maybe it was also from my own fear. This was not just a house. It was the home of Adrian Blackwood, the richest man in Redwood Falls, a man known for his aloofness and chilly temper. They said he never smiled, and people whispered that he liked to be alone, locked away in his luxurious world. They also said that if you ever saw him in person, you would know right away that he had a different aura, like a storm behind his eyes. I breathed in slowly, thinking of how everyone claimed he despised all forms of closeness. Yet there I was, about to knock on his door, all because a friend insisted that Mr. Blackwood needed an assistant for his latest charity project. When the heavy door finally opened, I saw a tired-looking butler in a crisp black suit. He gave me a once-over, and I shrank under his gaze. Still, he held the door open and let me step into the marble foyer. The warm air inside assaulted my cold cheeks, and for a moment I felt dizzy. Chills ran up my spine as I looked around. The hallway was massive, with a glittering chandelier, a soft gold glow illuminating tall walls that were lined with priceless artwork. Yet there was no welcome, no sense of home. It felt more like a luxurious museum. My footsteps echoed, and that echo lingered in the silence, reminding me of how empty this place truly was. I barely had a chance to gather my thoughts when I heard a curt voice from the top of the wide staircase. "Who is that?" it asked. The butler cleared his throat and introduced me in a formal tone. Slowly, I lifted my head, noticing a man in a sleek black suit descending the stairs. His features were sharp, angled cheekbones, slightly tousled dark hair, and a jaw set with tension. There was something steely in his eyes, something that warned me not to speak out of turn. This was Adrian Blackwood, the billionaire whose presence seemed to fill every corner of his mansion. He paused halfway down the stairs, studying me with curiosity that turned quickly into a flicker of displeasure. He might have expected someone more elegant or more polished. I tried to stand straighter, but my wet clothes clung to me, and a drop of rainwater slipped from my hair onto the pristine marble floor. Adrian's eyes followed that drop with cold disapproval. He stepped closer, standing in front of me with his hands in his pockets. "You're here because you applied to be my personal assistant for the Redwood Charity Foundation, correct?" he said. His voice was quiet but deep, cutting through the hush like a blade. "Yes, Mr. Blackwood," I managed to reply, pressing my shaking hands together. It was not the most impressive first impression. I was shivering, soaking wet, and probably looked like a stray cat. "I was told you needed someone who can help with the event preparations. I have experience working with fundraising events at a local shelter." "Is that so?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. Before I could confirm, he spoke again. "My butler will show you to your room. Tomorrow, you will meet me in my office at exactly 8 in the morning. If you are late, you can leave." He then turned and walked away without another word. My breath caught in my throat. That was the entire greeting, a cold examination, a few clipped sentences, and then dismissal. I could already see that working for Adrian Blackwood would be no simple task. His presence felt like a constant storm, as if thunder clapped inside his mind and lightning flickered behind his eyes. But I had come here to do a job and to do it well. Even if he intimidated me, I would not give up so easily. The guest room I was taken to was lavish, with a four-poster bed dressed in crisp white linens. There was a small sitting area near tall windows overlooking the back garden. A sofa upholstered in soft gray velvet, along with a golden lamp that gave off a soft glow, made the place feel almost too grand for me. I felt like I had stepped into a fairy tale castle, except there was no warmth in the air. The walls seemed thick with lonely secrets. Exhaustion washed over me, and I decided to take a hot shower to chase away the chill in my bones. The bathroom was even more luxurious, full of marble and gold fixtures that gleamed under subtle lights. As the water ran down my shoulders, I tried to gather courage for the day ahead. Adrian Blackwood was not just difficult. He was untouchable in a way. Everyone who talked about him spoke in hushed tones, as though he could hear them anywhere in Redwood Falls. They told stories of how he had built his empire from next to nothing, how he had crushed opponents in ruthless business deals. Yet he was also known for his generosity to orphanages and hospitals, his huge donations that kept entire programs alive. But apparently, while he was kind in giving money, he was harsh in everything else. I got out of the shower and dressed in some dry pajamas that my friend had lent me, too tired to fully explore my new surroundings. My reflection in the mirror looked worried. The reason I had ended up here was partly out of desperation. I had no job and was behind on rent. My friend heard about an opening for a personal assistant at Redwood Charity Foundation, with the possibility of earning a decent salary if I could survive the tasks. It was rumored that the hours would be long, the demands impossible, but the pay would be enough to start fresh, perhaps pay off some debts, and have a stable life again. I needed that chance. I slipped between the covers of the large bed, taking one last look around the quiet room before drifting off to a troubled sleep. I wondered if I could handle the force of Adrian's icy personality without falling apart. I would only discover that answer in the morning. The next day, I woke early to make sure I would not be late. I put on my best outfit, a neat blouse, a pencil skirt, and low heels. I took a few steadying breaths, and then headed to the office Adrian used for meetings. My heart thumped inside my chest as I walked down the long corridors, passing elegant furniture and paintings that looked like they belonged in a famous gallery. The mansion was a maze, but the butler had kindly given me directions. When I reached the office, I paused in front of the thick wooden door. The letters AB were engraved on a small plaque. My mind buzzed with nerves. I knocked softly, and a few seconds later, I heard a clipped, "Come in." Inside, Adrian sat behind a large oak desk stacked with files. His suit today was dark blue, his tie a deep gray. It looked like he had stepped out of a magazine advertisement, except his expression was all business. No warmth, no smile. He motioned for me to sit. "You're on time," he remarked, as if that was the bare minimum. He crossed his arms and fixed me with that same critical stare. "We have a fundraiser in 2 weeks. Preparation is behind schedule, and I don't have the patience for mistakes. Do what you are told, and we won't have any problems." I nodded, trying to keep my voice steady. "I understand, Mr. Blackwood. I'm here to help." My stomach clenched, but I reminded myself that I needed this job. His gaze flicked to a neat pile of papers. "These are the vendor lists, the guest lists, the proposed menus, and design sketches for the hall. Go through them. Note any issues. I have a conference call in 1 hour, and after that, I will expect you to brief me on any changes that need to be made." It was an overwhelming amount of work, but I forced myself not to show fear. "Yes, sir," I said, picking up the files and focusing on them. Despite the size of the job, it felt good to dive into something concrete. Organizing details and checking facts was something I knew how to do. Perhaps I could prove my worth through diligence. Over the following days, I learned that Adrian liked to keep a distance. He never asked how I was or if I needed anything. Instead, he gave me tasks with strict deadlines, expecting me to deliver every single time. I also discovered that he was brilliant in business. He remembered every name, every figure, every nuance of a deal. There was no fooling him, and no excuse would be accepted if something was done incorrectly. That said, I could see glimpses of a deeper side to Adrian. When he spoke about the charity and the orphans who would benefit from the fundraiser, I noticed his eyes soften. He never smiled, but there was a gentle spark that flickered, and then he would mask it quickly. Maybe he didn't want anyone to see that he cared, as though caring was a weakness. One evening, I worked late in the study, poring over some spreadsheets. Adrian entered and paused, as if he was surprised to see me still at the desk. He picked up a paper and read it, his brow furrowed. "Why are you revising the marketing budget?" he asked in a low voice. My heart skipped a beat. Had I stepped over a boundary? I saw that some funds could be reallocated to hire more local musicians. It might give the event a more intimate feel, which I think donors appreciate. He studied the numbers. "This is not a bad idea," he murmured, almost reluctant. "But next time, ask for my approval first." He did not scold me, though. Instead, he nodded. "Well done," he added under his breath. It was almost a whisper, but I caught it, and something glowed inside me. A small piece of ice had chipped away from the armor that surrounded him. That moment gave me hope that behind his frosty demeanor, there was a real human being. I tried to hold onto that small piece of kindness whenever he turned distant again. Days turned into a week, and the mansion seemed less intimidating. I got used to the daily routine, waking up early, meeting Adrian in his office, running errands, setting up calls, confirming vendors, arranging invites, and drafting schedules. Our conversations were still mostly about work, but the tension eased. I knew his patterns. He liked his black coffee at 7 in the morning. He wanted meetings to end exactly on time. He disliked small talk during business hours, but tolerated a comment or two about the weather or the location of the next meeting. Sometimes, if he was in a slightly better mood, he'd ask, "Did you handle the caterer, or have you confirmed with the band?" without his usual bite. One afternoon, as the sun dipped behind thick clouds, we had a short break from calls. I placed a mug of coffee on the corner of his desk. "Do you ever get tired of all this work?" I ventured, feeling brave. It was a casual question, perhaps too personal, but the silence was heavy, and I wanted to fill it with something more humane. He exhaled, but did not look at me. "Tired is not the right word," he said. "Work is all I know. It gives me a purpose. I see no reason to slow down." I nodded, looking at the lines of tension around his eyes. "Maybe a vacation would be nice," I offered gently. His expression turned colder. He glanced at me with a hard stare. "I didn't hire you to discuss my personal life," he said flatly. The wall between us slid back into place. He turned his attention to a file, effectively dismissing me. I felt stung by his cold response. I retreated to my desk, focusing once again on the tasks at hand. But something had changed inside me. I was starting to wonder if this man, who had said he would never love anyone, had locked his heart away for a specific reason. And I wondered why I was beginning to care. The fundraiser was drawing near, and with each passing day, the workload increased. Despite the stress, the staff began to notice that Adrian seemed a little less harsh. He was still direct and sometimes impatient, but every so often, he spoke to me in a calmer tone. Late at night, when we were both buried in schedules and calls, he would order dinner from the mansion's chef, and we would eat in silence. That silence was heavy with unspoken thoughts, but it felt surprisingly warm, as though neither of us wanted to be alone in separate rooms. At times, I would glance at him from behind my laptop. His face was always focused, his eyes scanning data or reading emails. In those quiet moments, the storms that raged outside seemed to mirror the tension in my own chest. I tried to remind myself, do not get too close. Adrian Blackwood, the billionaire who had sworn never to fall in love, was not just being stubborn. He was probably protecting himself from pain. If I let myself fall into any romantic illusions, I could end up severely hurt. One particularly rainy evening, we were reviewing the final guest list. The thunder rattled the window panes, and the lights flickered. Adrian looked up, frustration in his eyes. "I hate this kind of weather," he muttered under his breath. "We might lose power at any moment." Sure enough, the chandelier above us flickered again. Lightning flashed across the sky, lighting the room with a sharp, bright glow for 1 second. "We'll be fine," I assured him, though my own heart was pounding from the storm. Redwood Falls often had intense storms, but they never felt normal to me. Adrian stood and walked over to the window, hands in his pockets. He stared out at the torrent, and his reflection in the glass looked haunted. He seemed lost in his own thoughts, like a man who had secrets that weighed heavily on him. Suddenly, the power went out completely. Darkness swallowed the room. I let out a small gasp, and I heard Adrian's footsteps. He moved with surprising ease through the blackness. Then I felt him near me, a hand touching my shoulder lightly. "It's all right," he said softly. "We have a backup generator, but it might take a minute to kick in." My nerves calmed slightly at his presence, even though I could hardly see him. A part of me realized how unusual it was for him to comfort anyone. I also realized that despite his cold nature, there was a part of him that felt protective. Moments later, the generator whirred and the lights flickered back to life. We both blinked at the sudden glow. I noticed that Adrian's hand was still on my shoulder, a gesture that felt strangely intimate. He removed it slowly, clearing his throat as if to distance himself. "We should finalize these lists," he said in his usual composed tone, stepping back to his desk. He picked up a pen and busied himself, as though that brief moment of closeness had never happened. But I felt a shift inside me. My heart was thumping. There was an emotion stirring that I could not name easily. It was not just admiration for his dedication or gratitude for the job. It was something deeper, something that made my hands tremble as I resumed typing. I reminded myself that Adrian had sworn never to love, and that if I wanted to keep my job and my pride intact, I should never attempt to break through the walls around him. Yet, feelings are not always logical. Sometimes they bloom in silence, the way flowers find light through cracks in concrete. As the days marched closer to the big event, everything became more hectic. We arranged florists, confirmed final numbers with the caterers, and tested microphone systems for the host. We also planned an auction to gather more funds. Adrian was so busy that he hardly rested. Even in the late hours, I found him poring over spreadsheets and speaking with donors on the phone. I marveled at his stamina. The night before the fundraiser, I walked to the dining room to grab a quick snack. To my surprise, Adrian was there, seated at the long table with a glass of whiskey in his hand. He appeared lost in thought, the golden liquid swirling in the crystal glass. I hesitated in the doorway, but he noticed me and motioned for me to come in. "You should rest," I said gently, taking a seat a few chairs away. My voice echoed slightly in the large room. "Tomorrow is the big day. You'll need energy." He gave a short laugh, one without humor. "Rest never comes easy for me. When I close my eyes, I see regrets and failures." He took a sip of the whiskey. "That's why I focus on my work. It keeps me away from memories I don't want." I felt a pull to comfort him. "We all have painful memories," I offered quietly. "But sometimes facing them helps us heal. Otherwise, we end up running in circles." His jaw tightened. "I don't need to heal," he said. "I just need to do what I set out to do, build a legacy, and make sure no one can destroy it." He finished his drink and stood to leave, but paused, as though wrestling with a decision. Then he turned to me with a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes. "Why are you still here?" he asked. I blinked. "You mean in this mansion?" He nodded. "You've worked harder than most. Most assistants leave after a week. Why haven't you run away?" I swallowed. "Because I gave my word that I'd see this through. And because I feel like there's something worthwhile here. I care about this event and about helping you." Heat rose to my cheeks. I hoped he wouldn't see it. He stared at me for a moment, then looked away. "Don't care about me," he muttered. "I will never fall in love with you or anyone else. I don't want that. Understand?" His tone was harsh, but underneath it, I caught a tremor of doubt. I opened my mouth to reply, but he did not give me a chance. He walked away, his footsteps echoing in the empty hall, leaving me alone at the table with a mixture of confusion and hurt swirling in my chest. The day of the fundraiser arrived. The venue was at a grand ballroom in the city center. Lavish decorations transformed the space, elegant flower arrangements, polished silverware, and golden accents to match the Redwood Charity Foundation's theme. Wealthy guests from near and far gathered, dressed in their finery, eager to enjoy an evening of music, dancing, and generous giving. I stood near the entrance, checking off names on the guest list, ensuring everyone received their seating cards. Every now and then, I would look across the room at Adrian, who was greeting top donors with a well-practiced politeness. He looked incredibly handsome in his tuxedo, tall and confident, even if his expression was guarded as usual. He was the perfect host, making sure everyone felt acknowledged while never letting them too close. The night was a whirlwind of activity, a cocktail hour, a formal dinner, and a live auction. My tasks included coordinating with the caterers, ensuring the lighting was correct, and making sure the auctioneer had the right order of items. Several times, Adrian caught my eye from across the crowd, and we exchanged brief nods of reassurance. We had prepared for this moment thoroughly, and it felt satisfying to watch it unfold successfully. By the end of the auction, the charity had raised an impressive sum. The applause was thunderous. On stage, the host announced the total funds collected, which exceeded the original goal by a large margin. Adrian took the microphone, thanking everyone in his calm but confident voice. "Your contributions will help many children have a chance at a better future," he said. Though his tone was measured, there was a hint of emotion as he spoke about the cause. It was the closest I had ever seen him come to a public display of feelings. My heart swelled with pride for the role I had played, small though it was. Once the main program ended, a live band started playing. Guests moved to the dance floor, couples swirling under the soft lights. I noticed how elegantly they all moved, some older donors, some younger couples, everyone sharing in the success of the night. I felt relieved and a bit overwhelmed. It seemed everything had gone well, and no disasters had emerged to spoil the event. Just as I was about to step aside and catch my breath, Adrian appeared at my shoulder. "Come with me," he said quietly. Without waiting for my response, he led me through a side door to a small balcony that overlooked the city. The night air was cool, and the stars were visible above the glittering skyline. I could still hear the music from inside, muffled by the walls. "You did well tonight," he said, facing the view. "This event was the best we've hosted so far." I stood beside him, my heart beating fast. I realized how tall he was. "I'm just glad we reached the goal," I replied. "It's an honor to be part of it." He turned slightly, his eyes catching mine in the dim light. "I know I haven't been easy to work with," he murmured. "But you stayed. You helped me more than you realize." The warmth in his voice tugged at my emotions. Suddenly, I remembered his harsh words from before, "I will never fall in love with you." But as we stood there, so close, it felt like something was shifting. The city lights sparkled around us, and the distant hum of music gave the moment an intimate glow. Before I could overthink it, Adrian reached out and brushed a strand of hair away from my face. He paused as if uncertain. Then he said softly, "I'm not good at this. I don't allow feelings. But tonight, I want to thank you." His voice wavered. "Not just for the event, but for showing me that someone can believe in me without expecting something in return." My throat felt tight. "I think you deserve someone to care," I managed to whisper, "even if you pretend you don't." He closed his eyes and inhaled slowly, as though battling an internal storm. Then, without warning, he leaned forward and kissed me, softly, tentatively. His lips were warm and uncertain at first, but as I responded, the kiss deepened. My pulse hammered in my ears, and the world around us seemed to fade away, leaving only that fleeting moment of closeness. Then we broke apart breathless. Adrian's eyes shimmered with confusion and a spark of something I had never seen in him, longing. He seemed both vulnerable and intense, as though a door had cracked open in his heart, letting light pour into a place long kept in darkness. But almost as soon as the moment had begun, he pulled away. He pressed his hand against his forehead, turning his back on me. I need to go," he said, his tone raw. Without another word, he slipped back inside, leaving me alone on the balcony with my thoughts spinning. I remained there for a while, the night air cooling my flushed cheeks. Part of me wanted to chase after him. Another part of me wanted to cling to the railing and try to understand what had just happened. A single kiss had shattered the barrier that Adrian had placed around himself. But the question remained, would he let that door stay open, or would he slam it shut again out of fear? Eventually, I went back into the ballroom. The party was winding down, and guests were saying their goodbyes. I tidied up some paperwork, made sure the staff had everything they needed. Adrian was nowhere to be seen, and I felt a pang of worry. Did he regret what happened? Was I just a momentary slip in his carefully controlled world? When I returned to the mansion later, it was past midnight. I dragged myself to my room, exhausted and conflicted. My heart was full of emotions I could hardly name: excitement, hope, fear, confusion. I replayed the kiss in my mind, feeling my face flush. Even though I was drained, I could not sleep. I tossed and turned, staring at the ceiling, wondering what the next day would bring. The next morning, I woke up with a heavy sense of uncertainty. My mind was a mess of scattered thoughts. Adrian's intensity, his sudden kiss, his swift departure. Yet I had to keep my focus because there was a post-event wrap-up meeting scheduled with the Redwood Charity Foundation board members. I got dressed quickly, choosing a simple blouse and black pants, and made my way to Adrian's office. He was already there, sitting at his desk with a stack of papers in front of him. When he looked up and met my gaze, I saw a flicker of unease in his eyes. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, he cleared his throat and gestured for me to sit. "We need to finalize the details from last night," he said, his tone calm but distant. "I'm meeting with the board at 10 to go over the numbers and the next steps." I sat across from him, heart pounding, but forced myself to stay professional. We spent the next hour reviewing the financial breakdown, deciding how to allocate the funds, and drafting a thank you letter to the donors. The tension in the room was palpable, especially when our hands brushed while exchanging documents. Every time it happened, Adrian would pull back quickly, as if even the smallest contact burned him. By the time we were done, I felt like I had run a marathon. My nerves were shot. I wanted to discuss what had happened between us, but I also feared that if I brought it up, he would deny it or tell me again that he could never let himself love. So I remained silent, uncertain how to take the next step. As he stood to leave for his meeting, Adrian paused at the door. He looked torn, his lips parted slightly, as though he wanted to speak but didn't know how. Then he shook his head and stepped out, letting the door click shut behind him. I sank into the chair, an ache in my chest. It was as if a powerful wind had blown through both of us, but now he wanted to pretend it never happened. For the next few days, Adrian buried himself in work. Our interactions were polite and businesslike, almost as if the fundraiser had never ended and the kiss on the balcony had never happened. He spoke in clipped tones, avoided eye contact, and focused on planning a new project for the foundation. I could see him wrestle with something inside. If our eyes accidentally met, I caught glimpses of guilt or longing. But he always looked away and changed the subject. I tried to distract myself by planning a small celebration with the staff to thank them for their efforts. The event had been a triumph, and I thought it would be nice to reward their hard work. When I mentioned the idea to Adrian, he nodded curtly, approving the expense without any argument. That alone told me he felt some remorse about how distant he was acting. But he never gave me a direct moment to ask him how he felt. Late one evening, a thunderstorm broke out again. The noise echoed through the mansion's corridors, and I found myself pacing in my room. I felt trapped, uncertain, and emotionally drained. Finally, I decided to go to the kitchen to make some tea. As I tiptoed down the stairs, lightning lit the windows with stark flashes. I turned the corner toward the kitchen entrance and nearly ran into Adrian. He was standing there with a glass of water in his hand, his posture rigid. We both froze. "You couldn't sleep either?" I asked softly, hugging myself to keep warm. He shook his head, setting down the glass on the kitchen counter. The overhead light buzzed quietly, and the storm outside pounded the windows. His face was drawn, his hair slightly disheveled, as if he, too, had been wrestling with his thoughts. "I'm sorry," he said at last, his voice breaking the tense silence. "For what?" I asked, my heart in my throat. Part of me needed to hear him say the words. "For everything," he replied. for being cold, for pulling away after that night. I told you I'd never let myself fall in love. And then I acted on feelings I can't control. A clap of thunder shook the walls. I swallowed, stepping closer. You don't have to apologize, I whispered. But I am confused. Do you regret it? He stared at me, eyes full of conflict. I don't know how to regret something that felt so real. But it scares me. I took another small step. The air felt charged, as though the storm outside was mirrored inside us. You've built these walls, I said, my voice trembling. I don't want to tear them down against your will. But if there's a chance for something real, I'm willing to try. Are you? He drew in a shaky breath. Then, in a sudden burst of raw emotion, he closed the distance between us and cupped my face in his hands. I'm terrified, he whispered. I never planned for this, but I can't stop thinking about you. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the kitchen in bright white light. In that moment, we kissed for the second time, fiercely, desperately. The thunder rolled, and we stood wrapped in each other's arms, the storm raging around us. I felt his heartbeat racing against mine, and in that instant I sensed that a part of Adrian's fortress was crumbling, allowing something warm to enter. Our second kiss led to a night of deeper conversation and closeness. We ended up sitting on the plush sofa in the library, the storm still raging outside. The warm glow of a single lamp cast our silhouettes on the wall, and I felt a gentleness in Adrian that I had never thought possible. He told me about his past, how his parents had died in an accident when he was young, how he had grown up in a foster system that was less than nurturing, how he had vowed never to rely on anyone again. His success in business was driven by fear of being helpless and poor. As he spoke, I saw tears glint in his eyes, though they never fell. I rested my hand over his, giving him a silent promise that I was there to listen. He told me how he had once loved someone in college, but that person had betrayed him by stealing from his fledgling company. From that day on, he decided love was a liability he could not afford. I'd rather be alone than broken, he said, voice trembling. I felt tears well up in my own eyes. I'm so sorry, I whispered, unsure what else to say. Words felt too small to heal the wounds he had carried for so long. He let out a shuddering breath and looked at me. You've made me question that decision, he admitted. But I don't know if I have the strength to let myself care again. I squeezed his hand. It's not about strength, I said gently. It's about trust. I know it's not easy. I'm not asking you to change overnight. I want you to know you're not alone. He stared at our linked hands. I don't deserve your kindness, he said finally, but I can't let you go. His confession hung in the air, raw and honest. Then he pulled me into an embrace, resting his cheek against the top of my head. We stayed like that for a while, listening to the thunder outside and the quiet patter of rain on the mansion's roof. That was the night I realized I had fallen in love with him, with all his flaws and hidden sorrow. We talked until the storm began to fade. Eventually, we both fell asleep, curled up on that sofa. It wasn't planned, and it wasn't perfect, but it felt safe and real. In the days that followed, something shifted between us. Adrian was still the same efficient, sometimes distant billionaire at work, but he no longer kept me at arm's length outside of business hours. We shared occasional stolen moments in the mansion's hallways, small smiles, soft touches, and whispers that hinted at a growing bond. We never made big public displays of affection, and we certainly did not announce anything to the staff. But we lived in a different atmosphere now, one in which hope coexisted with fear. We still had arguments. Adrian was stubborn and had a tendency to push people away when he was stressed. I was sensitive, easily hurt by his sharp words. But we began to learn how to talk through issues, even if it took time and patience. Sometimes he would apologize in a quiet voice, clearly unused to admitting fault. Other times, I would admit that I overreacted. Slowly, we grew together, navigating the delicate steps of building trust. One evening, I saw Adrian waiting for me by the front door. He was wearing a dark coat, and his posture was stiff with uncertainty. I have a surprise, he said, handing me a smaller coat. Put this on. Curious, I did as he asked, and we walked outside into the crisp night air. A sleek car was parked in the driveway, and the driver was someone I recognized from the household staff. Adrian opened the door for me, and I slipped inside, heart fluttering with excitement. We drove to the edge of Redwood Falls, where the city lights began to fade into rolling hills. Finally, the car stopped near a quiet, scenic overlook. Adrian led me out of the car, and we stood together, gazing at the moonlit view. Below, a gentle valley spread out, dotted with trees and the faint glow of distant lampposts. The sky overhead was a canvas of stars. He turned to me, taking my hand. "I used to come here as a teenager," he said softly. "When everything felt too heavy, I'd sneak away to this spot to think. No one ever came with me. But I want you here." My throat tightened with emotion. I looked at him, seeing the faint lines of worry and the raw hope in his gaze. "Thank you for sharing this place with me," I said, leaning my head against his shoulder. We stood like that for a long time, sharing the silence and the comfort of each other's presence. That night, as we drove back, I felt closer to him than ever. He was letting me into parts of his world he had hidden from everyone else. For a man who once swore he would never love me, he was taking a leap of faith, however cautious. Yet life has a habit of testing fragile bonds. A week after our secret outing, we found ourselves on the edge of a crisis. I received an unexpected phone call from an old colleague who worked for one of Adrian's business rivals. According to him, there were rumors that Adrian's former college ex, who had betrayed him, was back in the picture, trying to orchestrate a hostile takeover of one of Adrian's companies. It sounded complicated and dangerous, involving shares, hidden investors, and potential legal traps. My colleague warned me to tell Adrian to be on guard. When I approached Adrian with the information, I saw fear flash in his eyes. He clenched his jaw, taking a deep breath. "I knew something was off," he muttered. "I've seen small signs in the markets, like someone is buying up stocks in unusual ways." I didn't want to believe it was her. His tension was palpable. He retreated into his fortress-like mindset, diving into work around the clock. Our tender moments became scarce as he prepared to defend his business empire. I understood he was scared, not just of financial loss, but of emotional betrayal. The thought of facing that same person who had once nearly ruined him in college loomed over him like a dark specter. One night, I found him alone in the office, staring at documents on his computer screen. He looked exhausted, shadows under his eyes, a half-finished cup of coffee at his side. "Adrian," I said gently, moving to stand behind him. "You can't fight this battle alone. Let me help." He turned and met my eyes. For a second, I saw tears he was fighting to keep back. "I'm so afraid," he admitted, voice cracking. "If she succeeds, everything I built could crumble." I placed my hands on his shoulders, massaging gently. "You're not alone," I repeated. "Talk to your lawyers, gather your allies. Don't push everyone away, and don't push me away." Together, we worked late into the nights, researching, making calls to trusted contacts, building a protective wall of legal defenses around Adrian's companies. He still snapped at me sometimes, but I fought not to take it personally. I could see he was battling old demons, reliving the betrayal that had scarred him so deeply. Yet I stood by him, determined to be strong when he felt weak, just as he had been strong for me when I needed a chance at a job and stability. Eventually, the financial threat was neutralized. Adrian's lawyers and trusted partners found a way to block the hostile takeover before it could gain traction. The ex from his past never got close enough to cause permanent damage, and she faded back into the shadows. Watching Adrian's relief when the final documents were signed was like seeing a man lifted from a pit of quicksand. He exhaled and pulled me into a tight hug, burying his face in my hair. "Thank you," he whispered. "I wouldn't have survived this without you." After the chaos settled, we returned to a more normal rhythm. Our bond felt stronger, as though we had endured a test that proved we could rely on each other. One evening, as we shared a quiet dinner in the mansion's dining room, Adrian smiled, a small, genuine smile that I had never seen before. It was like a ray of sunlight breaking through a stormy sky. "I realize I've been unfair," he said softly, his eyes meeting mine across the table. I told you from the start I'd never fall in love. But the truth is, I have. Deeply. He paused, and I saw his hands shake slightly as he lifted his wine glass. I don't know how to be the perfect partner. I might say things that hurt you, but I can't deny what I feel anymore. My eyes brimmed with tears. I reached for his hand, our fingers locking together. All I've ever wanted is for you to be honest, I murmured. I'm not asking for perfection. I just want us to face life together, no matter how hard it gets. He nodded, relief washing over his features. I promise I won't run for my feelings anymore, he vowed. You deserve that. Time passed, and our relationship continued to grow in quiet but meaningful ways. We took small trips together, sometimes just driving out to that scenic overlook to watch the stars. Other times, we stayed in and enjoyed a simple movie night in the mansion's spacious theater room. Adrian began involving me in more of his charity work, even encouraging me to present ideas to the board of Redwood Charity Foundation. The staff noticed the shift in his demeanor. He was still a firm leader, but less prone to abrupt anger or silent brooding. It was as if a new chapter had opened in his life. Yet a big question loomed over us. What came next? We had never really defined what we were beyond a quiet understanding that we cared for each other deeply. One evening, while we were strolling through the garden, I asked, "Where do you see us going from here?" The moon was bright overhead, lighting the path. White flowers glowed softly in the lunar light. Adrian paused. He looked at the sky, then down at me. For the first time in years, I can imagine a future that isn't just about business success, he said. A future that involves sharing my life with you. But I'm also afraid of rushing. You've seen how complicated I am. I smiled gently. You're not the only one who's complicated. I have my own fears and doubts. But we can face them together, right? He nodded, pulling me closer. Yes. I just need you to be patient with me. That's what love is, I said softly. We kissed then, under the moonlight, a tender promise that we would move forward at our own pace, trusting each other more each day. Despite Adrian's progress, he still had moments where he retreated into himself. But each time, he opened up sooner, apologizing for shutting me out. We built a sense of home in the mansion that once felt so cold to me. Now, the corridors that echoed with loneliness began to echo with laughter, at least once in a while. Everything felt right, until I received a phone call that reminded me of my own family responsibilities. My mother, who lived a few hours away, became ill and needed assistance. I took a leave of absence from some of my tasks, telling Adrian I had to be there for her. He immediately offered support, even arranging for a private car and making sure she had access to the best medical care. While I stayed with my mother, he called me every night. Sometimes we spoke about mundane things, the garden, the events in Redwood Falls, or how the staff were handling tasks at the charity. But sometimes the conversation drifted to deeper feelings. He told me he missed me, that the mansion felt empty without me walking its halls. One night, his voice was particularly soft over the phone. "When you come back, I want you to move into a different room," he said. My heart skipped a beat. He cleared his throat, continuing shyly, if you'd like to stay in the master suite with me. I don't want to be alone anymore." Tears burned my eyes. "I'd like that," I whispered. It was a simple statement, but it meant the world to me. We had come a long way from that stormy night when he looked at me with icy disdain. Now he was asking me to share his most personal space. It took 2 weeks for my mother's health to stabilize. When I returned, Adrian was waiting for me by the mansion's entrance, his eyes warm, a slight smile on his lips. He held me close, and I felt the tension in my body slip away. "Welcome home," he whispered. That same evening, Adrian helped me carry my belongings into the master suite. It was enormous, with high ceilings, a large canopy bed, and windows that overlooked the sprawling gardens. I felt a bit overwhelmed, but he insisted that he wanted me there. "I've always been alone in this space," he said, almost shyly. "But it's time I share it with someone who matters." We spent the night arranging my clothes, mixing my belongings with his. It felt surreal, a clear sign that we had crossed another threshold in our relationship. As I placed my favorite books on the shelf next to his business manuals, he stood behind me and wrapped his arms around my waist. I leaned into his embrace, feeling safe. When we finally settled on the bed, the moonlight softly shining through the drapes, Adrian turned to me. "I never thought I'd let myself have this," he confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're changing me. Part of me is still scared, but a bigger part of me doesn't want to go back to the way things were." I cupped his cheek in my hand, feeling the slight roughness of his stubble. "I promise to stand by you," I said. "We'll face fears together." He pressed his forehead against mine. "I love you," he breathed, and for a moment I lost my words. This was the first time he had said it so plainly. My heart soared, and I kissed him with all the emotion I had held back for so long. We woke up the next morning in each other's arms. Sunlight spilled into the room, and birds chirped in the garden below. I glanced over at Adrian, who was already awake, quietly watching me. A tender smile touched his lips, and he brushed his fingers through my hair. "I could get used to this," he murmured, voice husky with the warmth of sleep. Laughing softly, I stretched and felt contentment wash over me. For a man who once vowed never to fall in love, he seemed perfectly at ease with the idea now. We decided to start the day with a small breakfast together, something Adrian rarely did before. He used to rush straight to his office, skipping the idea of a leisurely morning meal. But now we sat in the kitchen with fresh coffee, toast, and fruit, chatting about the little things that made life sweet. The staff tiptoed around us, smiling discreetly at the rare sight of Mr. Blackwood looking relaxed and happy. When we eventually headed to the office, we were met with an urgent message from Redwood Charity Foundation. The board was requesting a meeting about a new project, a large-scale children's center that Adrian had pledged to fund. Adrian, in his usual decisive manner, wanted to get started right away. We spent the rest of the day brainstorming, discussing plans, and sketching ideas. Our synergy was better than ever. Where Adrian provided financial insight, I offered organizational and creative input. By evening, we had a rough outline of the next big charitable venture. As we were packing up to leave, I teased him. "Careful, Mr. Blackwood. You're beginning to look like someone who has a heart of gold." He chuckled, a rare sound from him, and shook his head. "That's because I have you by my side now," he replied. The gentle admission warmed me to my core. Months rolled by in a smooth blend of work, laughter, and growing affection. The staff began to treat me less like an employee and more like a partner to Adrian. We traveled for some of his business conferences, and I would help him host small gatherings for donors at the mansion. Adrian was still the same man in many ways, dedicated, intense, and sometimes moody. But he had learned to communicate better and to open up when worries gnawed at him. In turn, I grew stronger and more confident, no longer the nervous assistant who had arrived on a stormy night. One weekend, Adrian proposed we visit a coastal resort to celebrate the success of a new children's center. We drove out to a tranquil location by the sea, where the waves crashed against the shore and seagulls cried overhead. The fresh, salty air was a welcome change from the hustle of Redwood Falls. We walked along the beach, hand in hand, our feet sinking into the wet sand. At one point, Adrian paused near a cluster of rocks where the waves splashed up, spraying cool mist. He looked out at the horizon, lost in thought. "I once believed I'd never let anyone get close," he said quietly. "And now I can't imagine life without you." I squeezed his hand gently. "Sometimes the biggest walls hide the kindest hearts," I replied. "You needed someone who wouldn't run at the first sign of trouble." He turned to face me, his eyes shimmering with emotion. Then he slipped his hand into his pocket and pulled out a small box. My heart kicked into overdrive. When he opened it, I saw a ring, simple, elegant, with a single sparkling diamond. My hand flew to my mouth in shock. "I don't want to waste any more time," he said, voice husky. "I've hidden from love long enough. Will you marry me? Share your life with me, truly and forever?" Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes. I nodded, unable to form words. Finally, I whispered, Yes, Adrian. Of course I will. He slipped the ring onto my finger, and I threw my arms around him, laughing through my tears as the waves crashed behind us. When we returned to Redwood Falls, the staff at the mansion cheered at the news of our engagement. My mother was overjoyed, already making plans for a modest but heartfelt ceremony. Adrian surprised me by suggesting we hold the wedding in the mansion's grand garden. It's the first place that truly felt like home once you were here, he explained. I agreed wholeheartedly. For weeks, the mansion buzzed with wedding preparations. Florists came and went, discussing arrangements of white roses and green ivy. Caterers sampled menu options. Tailors visited for suit fittings. Through it all, Adrian and I worked side by side, sometimes teasing each other about color choices and the flavor of the cake. His aloof mask had faded, though he still held a certain reserve around others. His eyes were warm when they found mine. On the morning of the wedding, sunlight streamed through the windows, painting the mansion with golden rays. I got ready in my old guest room for nostalgia's sake, slipping into a simple yet elegant white gown. My hands trembled with excitement. My mother buttoned the back of the dress while my friend, who had recommended me for the assistant job so long ago, styled my hair. Tears shone in her eyes. I always knew you two had something special, she said, smiling. Outside, guests gathered in the blossoming garden. A white aisle runner stretched across the lawn, flanked by flowers in tall vases. A string quartet played a soft melody. I could see Adrian at the end of the aisle, dressed in a classic black tuxedo. His gaze locked on me, and in that instant, everything else faded. My heart fluttered as I walked toward him, stepping carefully in my gown, aware of every breath, every soft note of the music. Adrian's eyes were filled with an emotion that spoke more than words could. It was love, respect, and quiet awe. When I finally reached him, we joined hands. I felt the warmth of his touch anchoring me to the moment. A gentle hush fell over the guests as the officiant began the ceremony. He spoke about love as a choice and a commitment. He said love was about facing storms together, about standing firm in the hardest of times, and celebrating the joys that life brings. My mind flashed back to that first stormy night, the fear, the tension, the uncertain spark that had ignited a bond neither of us could have predicted. When it was our turn to exchange vows, Adrian's voice trembled slightly, but his words were full of sincerity. I was convinced I would never love anyone, he said softly, his gaze fixed on mine. I kept my heart locked away. But you walked into my life when I least expected it, and you helped me see that vulnerability is not weakness. You taught me that trust is not a risk, it is a gift. And I promise, for the rest of my life, to cherish that gift and to love you with all that I am. Tears slipped down my cheeks as I spoke my vow. From the moment I arrived on your doorstep, I sensed there was more to you than the world could see. You were like a fortress hiding a lonely king. You let me in, and I discovered a man of fierce loyalty, deep compassion, and unwavering resolve. I promised to stand by you, to support your dreams, to share in your burdens, and to love you beyond any measure. A hush of emotion hung in the air as we exchanged rings. The officiant pronounced us husband and wife, and Adrian leaned in for a tender kiss. Applause exploded around us, but we were lost in that moment of pure joy. It felt like the final piece of a long, turbulent puzzle was now in place. The reception was a warm celebration, filled with laughter, dancing, and heartfelt toasts. The once cold mansion grounds were alive with music and the chatter of loved ones. Even the sky seemed to smile on us. No storms, just clear sunshine and a pleasant breeze. Adrian surprised me with a dance under the glow of lanterns. He wasn't the most graceful dancer, but he tried, and I couldn't stop grinning. Guests circled around, cheering as we twirled slowly to a soft tune. Later, as the party began to wind down, we snuck away for a quiet moment alone on the balcony. The same balcony where we had shared our first kiss during the fundraiser. The city lights shimmered in the distance, and stars dotted the sky. Adrian wrapped an arm around my waist and pulled me close. "Do you remember how tense that night was?" he asked, a trace of amusement in his voice. I nodded, resting my head on his shoulder. You were so distant, and I was trembling with nerves. I had no idea a kiss would change everything. He pressed a light kiss to my temple. "Thank you for breaking through my defenses," he said. "For never giving up on me." A contented sigh escaped my lips. "Thank you for letting me in," I whispered. "For trusting me." He tightened his hold on me, and we stood there, letting the cool night air wash over us. The journey that began with him swearing he would never fall in love had led us here, to a promise of sharing our lives. In the warm glow of the moment, the fear, the heartbreak, and the lonely nights all felt far away, replaced by an overwhelming sense of gratitude and peace. And so we stayed, content in each other's arms, knowing this was only the start of the next beautiful chapter in our story, a story that once upon a time, neither of us could have imagined would ever exist. Our wedding night was full of gentle smiles and quiet words of devotion. In truth, there was only one lingering mystery that neither of us had yet addressed, the question of whether our differences might someday drive us apart. Adrian's life had been governed by high-stakes deals and the brutal truth of every man for himself, while I cherished closeness and the warmth of shared dreams. We both knew love doesn't guarantee a smooth path. But as we talked late into the night, lying in the Grand Master Suite, we promised each other that we would meet every challenge head-on, together. Weeks later, as if the universe decided to throw one final test our way, the Redwood Charity Foundation faced a scandal. An anonymous tip hinted at embezzlement within the organization. Adrian, outraged, vowed to investigate the matter thoroughly. We worked side by side to uncover the truth, combing through financial records and interviewing staff. The tension mounted, and for a few days it felt as though the foundation's good name and our peace hung in the balance. Reporters circled like vultures, hungry for any sign of a big story.